Bill. I am pleased to introduce Ivan Amato, who is an author and science communicator, and he is currently working as a visiting researcher at the Moonshot Catalog, which is a project at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He is the author of multiple books and has written and edited for many publications, including Time, Fortune, Science, and Nature. Ivan recently produced a podcast series, Voices from DARPA. He has also worked for National Public Radio's Science Desk and Discovery Incorporated Science Channel. In 2011, he founded the DC Science Cafe series here in the nation's capital. More recently, he established Cafe KITP in Santa Barbara, California, for the Kavli Institute of Theoretical Physics. He holds a master's degree in the history and philosophy of science from Indiana University and a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Rutgers University. So, welcome, Ivan.
Thank you. Okay. So Sarah, thanks for the introduction. I'm going to actually walk around. You guys scare me, the three of you do. But what a terrific service that really is. We'll do a little instant peer review perhaps after this, but in private, because I don't want everybody to hear all the things you're about to say. Because I'm about to violate, actually, I think one of the laws of presentation, because I'm going to challenge you to, you don't even have to look at the words I'm going to tell you, but to multitask. So in a sense, I'm inviting you to not pay attention to me just a little bit as I go through the rest of my talk. Because I was asked to make this a little bit interactive. And this actually connects a little bit with the session we just went through and enjoyed. It wasn't an endurance task with the three speakers just before. What I challenge you all here to do is to think about yourselves as scientists and technologists, engineers, in an astonishingly important arena of nuclear security. Because of this privilege to be here, I've learned a lot about NNSA, National Nuclear Security Administration, and all of the broad things that go on and just how important that is for the country and for me as a citizen. So there's a lot of really important things going on here, and I challenge you to think about what you are doing, how you are working within that context, and what kinds of stories that you actually do have to tell that would be of interest beyond this choir here. That's one of the tasks. The second one is to think about those stories you think are interesting beyond the choir within the context of the various channels of communication that I'm going to talk to you about, some of which will be familiar to you and some of which probably will not. And then I'm hoping a couple of brave souls will volunteer at the end in the last segment of our session here together to share the stories that you think are of interest to a wider audience. And then we can kind of work together, have a little bit of a discussion to imagine what channels of communication might be most suited for a particular story. The first speaker of the last trio, for example, had absolutely gorgeous hydrodynamic images. I instantly saw images of those in an art gallery with deep captions. I imagine the art opening and drinking wine and the whole thing. I was still listening to what was going on. And a tip, as you multitask in this talk, I'm stealing a kind of analytic framework for thinking about stories from my wife, who's a children's book writer, has about 18, 19 books out. It's called The Wow Story. And it's very simple. It actually goes back to Aristotle. It's the basis of narrative, which is to say that there is a protagonist who wants something. That's the first W of the wow. The protagonist is confronted by obstacles on the way to getting that which he or she wants. Obstacles, that the O is the O in the wow. And then the second W in the wow is the protagonist wins or loses. So it probably should be wowel, but we're going to, I want to honor my wife here who came up with this. And pretty much any narrative that you find interesting, you should be able to map this simple framework onto that story. You should be able to find out what the protagonist wants, what the obstacles are, and the resolution. Okay, so why do we want to tell science stories? I don't think it's a big sell here, but just to just say that I think there's all kinds of reasons. But for me, I look at the science story going from the Big Bang all the way through to this moment where we are a civilization on a little planet in a spiral of the Milky Way. It is the greatest story ever told. There's from stem to stern. So absolutely fabulously interesting. The scientific way of thinking and answering questions, it's led to illuminating and empowering story about how nature works. There's almost nothing more emblematic about that, how nuclear science, fundamental nuclear science, has led to all kinds of nuclear technologies, for better or for worse. There's a humility to the science story in the sense that it's all about provisional truth. As new evidence comes into hand and as new theoretical frameworks comes in, we change that story. It might be done reluctantly, when some people kicking and screaming, but eventually, as the adage goes, truth wills out. So I like that about the scientific story. That's not true of other epistemic frameworks, but it is true of science. The story is packed with drama, which is to say, it's a wow story. It's a wow story in the big sense, because we all, science is trying to understand how nature works. That's the goal. The obstacle is hard to figure that out, and then we kind of win. But each one of you also has micro wow stories along the way. Every different discipline has its own sort of wow framework as well. So that's true about science. People love great stories, and you have great ones to tell. And then there's also sort of, when science writers get together and try to convince ourselves that we're actually doing some social good, we say to ourselves, well, another reason for telling science stories and technology stories is because science and technology are drivers of our times and are important to really have a grasp of for making all kinds of decisions, personal product purchase decisions, and who we're going to vote for, and what we're going to worry about and what we're not going to worry about. So there's a real pragmatic value to telling science stories. And another one, and this is a bit of a platitude, but it's one that I was kind of a driver for my entire career, and in particular starting up the Science Cafe some years ago, which I'll talk to you about in a little while. But in my opinion, the greatest gift that science has to offer humanity is the opportunity to experience awe as science reveals how nature works. If you really just stop and think about all the phenomena that scientists have been, sort of revealing, both sort of just in their materialness and the way they function, it's just absolutely, astonishing. So, and the two images here, and images are really important, I think, in science. Telling science stories and communication, lots of opportunity, and I saw some in my 20 minutes here. Who knows what happened yesterday and the rest of the morning. These two are sort of bookends of 40 orders of spatial magnitude, and so in a sense are bookends of all the phenomena we know about in the universe. The top right is coming from CERN. That's an image from a high energy particle collision. Yes, falsely imaged, falsely colored rather. And so there's actually debates about whether one should do that or not, but I really like it. It's pretty. And then the bottom one is, in a sense, a portrait of the universe. That's a portrait of the cosmic microwave background radiation. So you go from 10 to the 15 meters, what is that, a thousandth of a trillionth of a meter or a millionth of a nanometer, all the way up to 10 to the 26 meters, 40 orders of spatial magnitude sort of sandwiched between those two images. Little segment here, I just want to go through a very quick telescopic history of science communication. There had been traditions even in the 19th century, particularly in Europe, particularly in England, of public lectures where people would go, 500, 600 people would go to a gathering place, and a famous scientist at the time would give lectures and presentations. That still, of course, does happen. But when it comes to sort of mass media, I look at about the 1920s as one of the starting points there. In fact, one of the originators of mass media science communication is an organization now called Society for Science and the Public. It used to be called Science Service. It's actually where I got my start. That organization is the publisher of Science News. Does anybody know of that publication? So Science News actually started as a radio dispatch, a telegraph dispatch that went out to the early radio announcers in the 1920s. 1920s is really when radio itself started to proliferate as a medium. People were just getting their initial radio sets at the time. And at this, I call this the cheerleader era because this was really when some very interesting scientific discovery would be made. The early science writers would write about it, put it on the teletype, goes out to the radio announcers, and then it disseminates from there. Later, Science News did turn that into a print product, which still exists, and of course now it's got its online extensions as well. A couple of decades later, I might call this the Watchdog era. This is sort of as more examples, more expressions of some of the darker sides and the double edge of science and technology came to the fore a little bit more with things like DDT, interestingly enough, an absolute wonder chemical when it first came out, reducing the incidence of malaria, but then as it got out and disseminated and its stability sort of kept it in the environment. Rachel Carson, of course, the most famous person to bring the dangers of DDT to the public's eye. Even earlier, Eisenhower bringing up the military-industrial complex, seeing how the sort of technology and business and corporations getting involved in ways that concerned him very much. And so the point of all this is that rather than just being raw science, we now have a phase, Watchdog era, where there's more, journalists are taking, in a sense, more of a kind of adversarial view, a more critical view, the way a policy writer might look at politicians and candidates. And I should point out that the oh wow or the cheerleading era, it doesn't disappear. These are not things that disappear, but they kind of all accrete. So they all of these eras, in a sense, are together now. So public relations era, so as the more critical view of science writers starts to become part of the science communication landscape. There's corporations and all kinds of stakeholders get concerned about how science and technology and perhaps the money-making aspects of those things are affected by the presentation, by the communication, and so you start getting much more kind of the spin kind of dynamic going on, different stakeholders trying to influence how journalists and the public look at various aspects of science and technology. And now, the internet comes in and sort of blows everything up. It blows every single sector up in different ways. What it did in journalism is it essentially gave the keys to the publisher's office to everybody. And so, whereas in all those other eras, the journalist was in some sense a gatekeeper for the public. So, there was a sense that you could trust the journalist in adjudicating all of these different kinds of spins coming in and hopefully getting a story that you could trust. Now, the voice of the journalist has diminished as the voices of many others have come on up into just a kind of cacophonous din with all kinds of people weighing in on kind of the same thing. Gets a little bit harder to know what to think and what to believe. So I call that a deconstruction. It's also hopefully, and this is the optimistic side of it, is maybe it's a reconstruction. The wonderful thing about the internet is that you can combine many of the channels of communication, which I'm about to get into in just here in a bit. Right there. I mean, you've got print, you've got image, you can bring in sound, you've got video. So it opens up all kinds of storytelling options that weren't really there in the past. And there are some really beautiful examples of I think, online publications, internet publications that are embracing that opportunity. This just gives you an example when I said how the journalist's voice is sort of diminishing as other stakeholders are coming in with a voice, as those are coming up. So this just sort of shows you in a health communications network. There's the journalist circled. It gives me a feeling of self-importance. But and then you see dozens of other stakeholders who can come in and also weigh in on what it might be. Vaccines is an interesting issue of our time right now. Just to give you a sense of who is consuming science news, this is from the Pew Research Center, and I'm not going to spend much time on these, but the interesting thing to me about this is that just 1 in 6 adults are active science news consumers. These are people who kind of care about science, they're interested, they're happiest on Tuesday when the Science Times comes out, or when the Post health section comes out. But that's not, that's kind of a remarkable thing. 1 out of 6 people, kind of are passionate about keeping up with what's happening in the greatest story ever told, science. What you see on the left are just some of the kinds of venues, some of the outlets at which people are getting their science communication. The top is really saying that half are getting it from kind of traditional sources, but then down on the left, there's museums and informal settings, podcasts, some are more drilled in magazines, like the ones that you get from the Krell Institute, Science, Nature, those kinds of things. Actually going to skip that one. So what I want to do now in a way is by recapitulating to some degree my own journey as a science communicator, I will be able to introduce to you a whole sequence of channels of communication. And it's just been a joy for me to kind of learn about these and embrace these in the course of my years as a science communicator. What's interesting to me, and I think maybe this makes me a little bit more relevant to this group, is that I also started out with the idea that I was going to become a card-carrying scientist. My initial interest was neurochemistry. I was very interested in the brain-mind problem. How is it that 3 pounds of meat gives me this sort of immaterial seeming kind of experience of the world, feelings, emotions, all of these things that seem so different from what a material thing is. I wanted to kind of investigate that great multi-thousand-year-old mystery. For some cockamamie reason, I thought that neurochemistry was the approach. That's by learning about ions. We were talking about ions, sodium going across neural membranes or proteins and cellular structures. I thought somehow this was going to really reveal these great mysteries. What happened relatively quickly was that I realized that the neurochemistry puzzle is about 10 million pieces. No one mind can subsume 10 million pieces of anything. Ergo, you cannot understand the brain-mind problem by way of neurochemistry. So that was actually a bit of an identity crisis for me. I got over it. But along the way, while doing it, I developed a first-hand love for the beauty of science. One of the things that I was doing in the course of my misguided journey into neuroscience was that I did what was called immunofluorescence. I was studying what are called the cytoskeletal proteins. These are proteins that form scaffolds inside of cells, give cells shape. They play a role in the way cells move. They play a role in the way things are transported within cells between organelles and that sort of thing. But when you are studying those and you come up with a fluorescent label, and put that on an antibody that goes straight for the protein you're interested in, it goes there and it's like a little beacon. This is where the protein is. You end up with these absolutely stunning fluorescence images. And I never really forgot that. That was kind of my take-home message from all of all of the pains of working in a laboratory. I'll come back to this. So I'm actually grateful for taking that dive into the laboratory because it really turned me on to the beauty of data. And this is where a double beheading comes in. I won't get too graphic. When I had run out of my cells in my neuro lab days, I told the supervisor, I'm out of cells, what do I do? And he said, come in on Saturday. I didn't know really what was going to happen. And on that Saturday, there were a couple of rats. These are just representatives. These are not the actual guys. So there were a couple of rats. There was a guillotine, let me put it that way. I will go through no more details. We got our cells, and I was able to continue to make those beautiful images that you saw. However, what I did learn is I didn't want the beheading of rats to become a regular part of my career. So that's what drove me into history and philosophy of science. So I wanted to stay in the science world, loved science. I thought, maybe in fact this is a way of looking at science in a much bigger way, rather than, at least for the first part of a career as a scientist, having to sort of hyper-specialize and ask incredibly drilled-in questions. And along the way here, I had another identity crisis, which is that as I was a graduate student, I realized I didn't really want to just spend my life pleasing professors. I got much more interested in sort of the idea of maybe combining my love of science, my love of writing, and communicating to a general public. Again, the greatest story ever told. This is just an homage to a wonderful professor at IU, and Sarah Webb knows this person because she also studied under her, and she was quite instrumental in a sense, letting me give myself permission to leave the world of science proper and go into science communication. And in fact, this is the beginning now of a segment on all kinds of channels of communication. So the thing about Holly Stocking is she instantly considered you a professional when you started her class, and she said that you should publish your articles. This was a kind of a remarkable thing to say to a young graduate student, publish it, really. And so I took her seriously, and I was able to get one of my very first science article, which was actually on something called the fifth force, which now maps a little bit onto things like negative energy, into a South Central Indiana newspaper called the Daily Herald Telephone, though locally that was called the Horrible Terrible. So my first article was in the Horrible Terrible, but also in the Indiana Daily Student, the student paper, which when I was writing these articles, it was this summer 3 times a week. And really the take home from this is that these are very traditional, the most traditional channels of communication, right? We're talking about little newspapers here. But I used those clips, and this also dates it, literally clips, right? I published in paper, take scissors, clip them out, and then I sent them to the editor of Science News. So we're getting back to, a sort of star in the history of science communication. I said, I want a science internship here, please. Again, Holly Stocking gave us the idea that we really needed to have clips to get into this game. Those were the tickets in. So to get those tickets, I essentially begged to get into Science News, and the beg won. So that's another, now we're talking about a magazine here that is and this was in some ways more like a newsletter. You'd actually have to roll it up to kill a mosquito with it initially. It's fatter now, but it is a representative of the magazine as a channel of communication, and then from there I was able to get on staff at Science Magazine, so really now getting into kind of a magazine in this case that is for the choir, right? So it's science communication primarily for scientists. Gets out a little bit more, but primarily that's what it is, so it's for the choir. And my interest, I thought the social role, the more important social role for a science communicator would not necessarily to write for scientists per se, but for a more general public. And again, that gets back to that platitude early, about how the greatest gift science has to offer humanity is the opportunity to experience awe. I kind of wanted to see if I could open the door to that to wider audiences, and so I reached out now as a freelancer and went into these other more sort of general readership types of publications. The first two a little bit more drilled in for the the science crowd and the geeky crowd, but Fortune and Time were really great experiences to really then start to write for a much wider audience. As I was covering more and more things in areas like material science in particular, I began to see that there are larger stories to tell, ones that are not as easy to tell in a short format, little 500-word article in a magazine like Science News, or a feature article even in something like Discover or Fortune. Larger themes, particularly in materials science and engineering. So I had this dream of writing a book. These are examples of some of the books I've done. The first one, Stuff, was really trying to look at the question of how did humanity figure out how to transform the raw stuff of the planet into the materials of the constructed landscape. It's really quite a big story. And as you know, the more capable materials are, the more capable technology is. That was kind of the story of that. Supervision, the one on the bottom right, that really is a reflection of that early immunofluorescence image that I showed. This is this spans 40 orders of spatial magnitude, but it's kind of a pictorial journey. Which is voguing the art, data as art, but in each case there's sort of a deep caption that tells a little bit of a wow story. And collectively you get this sort of pastiche of the big story of science. And then beyond print, all of that so far, those have been all channels that you've, in the print world, and you've seen all those before. But in addition, I had the privilege of learning a little bit about broadcast, the first one in the very early days of the Science Channel when it rolled out a series called The 100 Greatest Discoveries. I do have a background in chemistry. I actually tell people that for me is a language degree, not really a science degree. There's so much specialized language that half or almost 90% of the battle is really getting the language down. And once you've got that language, actually, scientists become happier to talk to you. You don't scare them away when you're just asking questions that are a little bit too basic. Can scare people away, but with the language, it's really a good entry in. So that was an interesting video experience, actually working with Bill Nye, which was quite fun. And then I had an opportunity to do 2 stints at National Public Radio. And this dates me too. This was at a time when we were literally cutting pieces of tape and pasting them with tape. I mean, so we don't have things like Audition and other digital tools now, which has spawned the podcasts and that audio channel out of what had been a pretty kind of rarefied crew of people in official kind of radio contexts. I was saying before how there could be a reconstructive aspect to the explosion that the internet has brought to writing and publishing. These are just some examples of some of the web and online communication sites that I find really promising and uplifting. Simon's Foundation, Quanta actually kind of maps a little bit, I think, more onto this community here, as would quarks to quasars. We were just, we weren't hearing about quasars, we were hearing about supernova, but close enough. These are just, all of you probably have your half-dozen go-to places for your online news. These are just some of mine, which I think these are some of the places that are using the power of the internet to do multimedia storytelling quite often. But there's more. But wait, there's more. Let's consider a couple of other kinds of channels of communication that perhaps some of your stories that I've asked you to think about might map onto. So in addition to nonfiction, which is the case for all of those earlier channels of communication that I had brought up here, you can also think about fiction as a means of talking about very difficult things. In fact, often that can be even a more it gives you more freedoms because you have to get things right when you're doing nonfiction. Well, you should actually get things right when you're doing fiction as well. But you have more latitude to kind of bring elements in that might be hard to find in altogether in nonfiction settings. So here's an example, actually, a mix of a couple of my favorite nonfiction writers, Oliver Sacks and Primo Levi, both of them not with us anymore, but Neil Stephenson, Diamond Age, sort of taking nanotechnology, gaming that out. Alan Bradley, The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie. In this case, actually a 15 or 16-year-old teenage protagonist using chemistry to sort of do forensic adventures and uncover mysteries. You learn a lot of really great chemistry in there. Some of the best chemistry writing actually is in this case, in a work of fiction, which I find, that you can find that out there. I was going to play this, but just I think the return on investment is probably less to go ahead and try to do that now. But I just bring this up because the podcast has also become just an absolutely enormous, popular channel of communication. I mean, how many people here listen regularly to podcasts? So it looks like about maybe half. Just here in the metro area, when you're on the metro, you see everybody absolutely plugged in, and a good portion of them are listening to podcasts. This was an incredibly fun project for me. I'd done a stint at DARPA in their public information office there, and I created and produced something called Voices from DARPA. In this case, what I would do is each month sit down with one of the program managers there. These are the ones with the sort of visionary technologies, and they get public treasure, in the sums of tens of millions of dollars to try to take these ideas and to sort of a prototype stage to either prove that these things are worthwhile pursuing or in fact not. So a negative result there is really in a sense important positive information. But this made me fall in love with the podcast format, and this is kind of an interesting set of data. This is from a data set that spans from 2004 to 2018 by the Royal Society in England. They just looked at nearly 1,000 podcasts over that period of time. About a third of those are in general science, and then it breaks down into much smaller little segments for specific areas. And I'm sure this is really just a portion of the science and technology podcasts out there. And you don't have to look at much of this at all, but except at the very top, which is fascinating to me, and that about 2/3 of these podcasts in this data set are produced by scientists or educators. So I think probably maybe non-research professors, and only about 10% from media. So I just kind of find that statistic quite interesting. But what it shows you is that this is a channel of communication that has been embraced by non-professional communicators, and it's the cost of entry in is not so much, and it really is a thrilling and rich format to play with. Is anybody here a podcaster or gotten involved with that yet? Okay. Moving on to additional channels of communication. These still familiar, but very rich. Technology in the movies. Strangelove is probably something near and dear to the heart of many people here. And I won't say much more about this, except that if you haven't seen The Man in the White Suit, it's old, it's dated, it's 1940, but it's fabulous, and what that's about is the emergence of polymer chemistry in the 30s and 40s, threatening traditional fiber industries like wool and cotton and silk. So there's this great sort of dynamic of corporate titans. But the best thing about it is I believe it probably has the best audio element in the history of cinema, which is to say the sound of the polymer chemistry table, the reaction table. It is the most amazing sound. So after this, go Google the sound for that, and you will be most amused. TV, where there's science and technology all over TV. These are just some examples. I put Chernobyl up here too. We're talking nuclear safety, so I thought that would be of particular interest to this group. Black Mirror, have people been watching Black Mirror? Absolutely, it's the quality I would say is mixed, but it is a amazing forum for looking at the technologies of the day, gaming them out as they, in fact, it's sort of almost an exercise or a discussion of unintended consequences. But almost every powerful technology has them, and I almost think that Black Mirror should be a required course almost for young scientists and engineers coming up to really begin to think about that very, very early on. What are the unintended consequences? What could they be of the really cool things that I'm working on, right? Now we're going to get into a few channels of communication that are probably less familiar. So everything you've seen so far, you've probably encountered, maybe you're consumers of yourself. I have become quite interested in the nexus of science and art. I mean, this is actually now becoming almost cliche. It's become an industry unto itself. It's called Sai Art. Many people refer to it. One of my early encounters was with a local artist, Nana Bagdavadze, and there's an amazing wow story that actually goes with this, but it begins with Nana, who's probably more my age now, but when she was young, she saved her sister who had a disease that required a family cell donor, and in the midst of that she learned a lot about cellular biology, a lot about molecular biology, and the imagery that came out of that, the science imagery came out of that, just became part of her art persona. And so she does, this is just an example of a series where she brings in, very cellular motif and lays that, ironically, so small cells becoming components of a kind of molecular motif that's quite familiar. But there really are now a lot of artists that are being, whose work is informed and driven by scientific concepts and imagery. This is just another example. I mean, if you take an artist or a photographer in this case and bring that person into the lab of a material scientist who has a lot of instruments like scanning electron microscopes, what you get is a kind of Ansel Adams-like nanoscapes. This was at the University of Georgia a few years back. So photography as a kind of channel to talk about arcane things like nanoscience and nanotechnology. This is just an example. When I was at the Kavli Institute of Theoretical Physics a couple of years back, the walls of that place were just lined with all kinds of gorgeous art. My guess is if you guys are at various institutions, you are graduate students here and others, almost every institution sort of recognizes that they have art on their hands, and so it goes on all the walls. Almost every science department is in a sense a little bit of an art gallery. And this was true also at KITP, the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics, and I ended up meeting Jean-Paul Hebert, who is a founder of what was called the algorist movement. And the idea of this that he was one of the early adopters of trying to use computers to actually generate art by creating algorithms that the computers would chew on and then churn out things like that pattern you see down on the left, which is actually a print that was on a wall. And in the case of the upper right, it's an algorithm that kind of drives a magnetic mechanism under that table with a metal ball on top that just continues to circle around a bed of sand according to the algorithm, which can change. And so every day, a different kind of amazing pattern would show up in the sand. As I was saying before, the last 3 or 4 slides are examples of this Sai Art movement, which really is growing to the point that even organizations are emerging. They're attracting money and organizing programs. This one in New York is really quite active. They put out a magazine. And now moving into another segment of channels of communication, which is to say the live channel of communication, and even comedy. So what you see up here is a guy named Brian Mallow, who is one of my favorite science comedians. I actually, my apologies to him and to you now, because I'm actually going to maybe give you a couple of little examples. If you don't laugh, that's okay. You probably won't. But so. A virus walks into a bar. The bartender says, "We don't serve viruses here." The virus says, "You're not a very good host." Schrodinger's cat walks into a bar and doesn't. And then the last one, which is actually, I was going to recruit maybe some of you to solve this problem, because I was on my way here to the meeting, and I walked into a cafe, a Italian cafe, and there was a set of Napoleons. They looked scrumptious, and then I looked below on a shelf in a glass display, and I couldn't believe this, but there was a bowl of pasta, and just a finger's width away, there was a bowl of antipasta. Out of their Vulcan minds, right? So So anyway, you will get a much better presentation of stand-up comedy if you have an opportunity to hear Brian Mallard. The thing that makes it an experience of science communication is that he doesn't just tell jokes. I mean, he actually gives a kind of framework. So you would learn a bit about nuclear physics, or you learn a little bit about biomedicine initially, and then the jokes would come in, and you would have the context to really enjoy them. Other examples, storytelling is sort of become an ascendant art form. The Moth you might have heard on NPR or been to a live event. Story Collider is in that space, but in particular they're looking for stories that have some kind of handle in the science and technology worlds. And this roams around major cities, so you can go online there and find out where it's going to be. And these are really compelling stories. And just as there was one example of one of these speakers up here who really kind of let a little bit of his own self come through. I'm fascinated. It's so interesting what these electrons are doing. This really kind of grabs onto that very personal experience and sort of honesty, and so it becomes a really rich experience to go to these story events. And just moving forward, there are something called Nerd Night. There's a bunch of these around the country. This is not entirely science per se, but this you might run into somebody who is a nuclear scientist, be one of the speakers, and the next one is an expert in 17th century French costume. So everybody drills in, but what you get in each case is the passion. Someone who probably knows more than just about anybody else on the planet about a certain subject, and so you are privileged to sort of have that experience. These are usually in bars, right? So it's usually and it's more for the 20 or 30 something crowd. So it's usually jam-packed, very lubricated with alcohol, and then you leave though having learned something. So these are great experiences. There's one not far monthly from where we are right now in this room. Even poetry. So this is this reminds me of a really wonderful experience I had when I worked for the American Chemical Society. And Roald Hoffman is a Nobel Prize-winning theoretical chemist at Cornell. But he also is someone who really marries the sciences and the humanities. He's been a poet for many, many years. And I organized a poetry reading in McCormick Convention Center in Chicago some years back. There were mass spectrometers over here. There was a display of beakers over here, and then here was Roald Hoffman with a microphone rather, and doing a poetry reading there in the middle of McCormick Convention Center. As you know, I mean, scientific discovery is such a rich thing that sometimes just normal language is not enough. And poetry is a way of bringing in a kind of multimodal expression, but still using words. And still in this arena of live channels of communication. So Roald not only is he a poet, but he's also a playwright. Was a fascinating example of using the stage as a way of examining unintended consequences or the double edges of technology. In that case, it was a beautiful synthesis of, I think it was Saxitoxin, which is a marine-based comes out of a sea animal, one of the most toxic substances known. And I won't spoil this, but so in addition to its beauty, the beautiful chemistry achievement, it had an underside to it that was very problematic and led to various ethical and moral considerations, and that unfolds on stage. Michael Frayn's Copenhagen is another one that got a lot of attention, and that's an example of a Sloan Foundation funded theater project, and that's a little bit, Sloan Foundation is one of the reasons why we're seeing more science on stage, and this was just a early and great example of that. One that I was personally involved with was with a choreographer in town, Liz Lerman. This was a project called A Matter of Origins. Actually, it was based on the Manhattan, some characters of the Manhattan Project. Really, the goal of this was to look at technology in our lives, focusing though on nuclear technology, which has a kind of, very, I think, powerful grab on the public, imagination. It's probably just the sense of maybe it's the most powerful technology out there, and maybe one of the scariest. So she used the Manhattan Project in Act 1 to kind of talk about powerful technologies. And then in Act 2, all 500 people who were at the Clarice Smith Performance Center, this is at the University of Maryland, were shuttled into 3 large rehearsal halls. Imagine each one of those almost like a wedding, filled with 20 banquet tables, about 10 people at each table, and at each table what was called a provocateur. I was one of these 50 provocateurs at these tables, and then the role for the provocateur at each table was to kind of facilitate a semi-scripted discussion about technology in our lives. But the thing that was amazing to me about this is this was live, we're shoulder to shoulder. It's somewhat improvised, and it was an incredibly vibrant way of having a science and technology communication experience. So much so that at that point I decided that I really wanted to have that as part of my own professional portfolio. So I started the Science Cafe here, DC Science Cafe, about 8 years ago. This is just an example of one of the latest ones, which was all about gravity, kind of focused on a local author who had written a book about that. But I did pair him with a master teacher from the University of Maryland, an astrophysicist there, and so they tag-teamed in a way that really, I think, made a rich experience for the 100 or so people that came here. The cafe, have people, how many here have been to a science cafe? Okay, so one. The idea of the Science Cafe, I mean, one of the taglines is, you eat, drink, think, and be merry, right? So you go to a place where you normally would go with your friends or family and to have a good time, where you're gonna fraternize, you're gonna eat, you're gonna drink. But in this case, we also bring in a real interesting, smart experience, enlightening experience where you learn something. So I recruit fabulously interesting scientists and engineers, although not only that, because I bring in poets and I bring in artists, who are on that Sai Art kind of nexus. They speak for a little while, and then I orchestrate a kind of room-wide discussion. And it's where people also can share their own experiences that might be relevant to the subject matter at hand. And these have just been incredibly rewarding experiences with a lot of very loyal attendees. I run about 40 some odd of these, and some people have been to almost all of them. This is an example of now taking that format, but now bringing, this was a science-themed poetry event, versed in science. And so these are two, the guy down below is a surgeon, the woman up on top there is it was an English professor at American University. The two of them also really spectacular poets who led an event some years back. But this was also an open mic. So this also gave an opportunity to others who, have been experimenting in poetic expression of their scientific experience. And we had about 8 or 9 people come up after the featured poets spoke. This is just an example of the other cafe that I started up in Santa Barbara. And what pleases me really about Cafe KITP is that it lives, right? So I started that up in 2014, and since then they've run about 15, 16 events. But what KITP gets out of it is a way of talking about theoretical physics, and related areas. On State Street in Santa Barbara, to the general public there. So they're very happy to have that channel of communication outside of the choir. It's a way of working on town and gown relationships. So it turns out to be a pretty valuable thing. You don't have to, actually what this map shows you is, and it's kind of old, so you'd have to check, but you pretty much can find a science cafe in any major city around the country, and the upper map shows that it's actually a global phenomenon. It really did start in England during the Mad Cow episode some years back, where scientists were concerned that the public was not getting proper information from the government, and so they decided they would take the mediation of the information away get people into pubs with them directly, and that was one of the origins of the Science Cafe movement. And so you're sort of taking away the mediation. And that's what's kind of interesting about it. I call it, in my case, a defiantly live channel of communication because I do not stream it, I do not record it. You need to be there and have the experience. So defiantly live. Part of that is because I'm lazy. I don't want to actually have to worry about those things. It's a labor of love and volunteer effort. But I think there is just something magical, as you all know, when you go to theater or anything else that's live. Well, now you have live, science. Okay, so that's it. That's for the tour of channels of science communication. So I'm hoping some of you actually did do some multitasking along the way. And what I want to do now is just hear from you what story you think would be of interest to a wider audience, and then let's see if we can put a wow framework on that, and then think about what channel of communication would be a good way to go. So who's going to be the brave first person? I was not even, yeah, there we go. Yeah, there we go. By the way, great. No, it wasn't you. Someone has a great shirt on. It was the first speaker reflecting, there it is, the cosmological object specter, the cosmic object. Yeah. Oh, but I have a periodic table on my socks, by the way.
So I guess I've got a cop-out because something I've already sort of done. That was when I was talking about collisions, I came up with a personal essay that kind of talked about collisions and the idea of discovery in my research. It was kind of short because I submitted to the essay contest this year and it was really rough, probably. So, but thinking more about that, not just collisions in my research and how these electrons gain energy through collisions, but thinking about my career path and that I'm always just making random turns, and never thought that I would end up there. So having that same idea.
No. So that's interesting, right? So we all have professional aspirations, right? So I mean, when you think about a couple of years ago or now, I mean, and actually I don't want to put you on the spot. Maybe this is but what did you imagine would be a professional endpoint, say in 5 or 10 years for you? What did you really want to do as a professional scientist?
So I guess at the beginning I always thought that I wanted to be a researcher. I did think that I'd end up in a national lab maybe, but it was even more than just like the career paths, it was the research. At first I was like, I'm definitely going to do fusion, or I'm definitely going to do plasma physics. And then I did a research, and I've learned more about this different thing, and I just keep on changing paths. And each time it's been a great experience.
Right. Okay. So I mean, this is kind of interesting. What you're saying is that your own career path kind of reflects the way the stochastic experience, or the way particles kind of bounce into one another. So that's actually, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if I were, and as an essay, kind of, it's almost a kind of a poetic idea. It stands alone there. It's hard to say what would be a wow story there, unless there's some kind of goal, an endpoint, right? So you're bouncing around. Maybe that you want to, be involved in ensuring security for the citizenry, right? I'm just trying to map a little bit into why we're here. That might be, but you didn't know exactly where you wanted to be, so you're bouncing around in here trying to find that groove. But you wouldn't have to go there. I mean, you decided to go with a kind of essay because you saw this connection, between your professional trajectory and something very, deep in physics. So, I like that. I almost want to challenge you to write a poem. Okay, we've got somebody here.
So I have a very similar kind of feeling about that. Like, I relate to that because, I sort of didn't have direction or a specified goal in mind for 5 years out. So that's maybe something that I want, and my obstacle is trying to sort that out and bouncing around and just kind of, following what is the easiest path for me, people making decisions for me, and maybe winning was seeing the beautiful path that got me to where I am today, and maybe the direction is not well defined right now, but I'm always moving forward and learning along the way.
Right. So just in this journey, is it that you were trying things and finding this isn't quite right, or is it you didn't want to lock yourself in because you felt, wait, there might be something even better over there, doing something else?
For me, like
Which is an experience we all have.
I didn't even know I wanted to do a PhD in the first place.
Do a what?
A PhD.
PhD, yeah.
I was in the middle of my master's when I had to decide whether I was going to take the GRE or not. So at that moment, I just, okay, well, I'll just do it just in case. I'm doing what I'm good at. I'm doing school. School's what I'm good at. And it just kind of led me along this path that I didn't have planned in the first place. So.
Okay, and where are you at now? What are you doing?
I'm at Sandia National Labs.
And working on what?
I'm working on laser science and fusion.
Okay, so fusion it's always been kind of one of those technologies that's always over the hill, right? It's always, I don't mean dead and old and sad. I mean it's just hard, right? So, but it's also kind of viewed as one of those savior technologies. Man, we need it at some point. So. Instantly, just the fact that you're in fusion, I would be able to, I think, spin a bunch of wow stories. I mean, it's just a fantastic story of frustration so far with a lot of innovation along the way. And maybe we're at a point. Maybe the time is now that or in the next 20 years rather than 50 or 100, that we might be on track to having that. So there'd be all kinds of ways of creating good wow stories there. Many channels of communication too, I think, would work. Standard feature articles could work. First person kind of essay with, again, that sort of goal in mind. You want to be part of this great tradition of reaching for the stars in some ways, literally. And then there's all kinds of visual possibilities as well. So anyway, I see somebody back there.
So I can relate to all of this, except I come from a completely different background.
Yeah.
I was actually a trained jazz musician for about over 10 years. Originally went to college for music. Decided to drop out because, I wanted to do something more practical. A lot of my family members are musicians now, but they didn't end up so well, right? And I didn't want to be like that. I didn't want to use my diploma as the blankets in the streets. So, unfortunately. So, decided to pick up something practical, bounced around a lot, tried to do maybe something in the public policy area, tried to do something maybe in the math, science areas. Honestly didn't know that I would end up dedicating my life doing a PhD in the material science area.
Material science.
Yeah. My bachelor's was in actually biomedical engineering. So now I'm doing a completely different thing from what I started when I was a little kid and what I studied in college, and now I'm just I've never knew that I would come towards this path. So I don't know. I have a feeling that I would do something completely different after I graduate. Maybe I would go into banking. Who knows? Be a sellout.
Right. But so just a couple of things come to mind there. So if I were working on a story, maybe on material science, and I talked to you, and I found out that you were on this track to becoming a musician, that's instantly interesting to me. Partly because you probably know Greg Olson,
Yes.
right? So who's a jazz musician as well. So Greg Olson is, I don't know if he's retired or he's at Northwestern, which is one of the cathedrals of material science. And he told me that the way he uses his music interests, in particular his improvisational interests and practice, is when he thinks about the complexity of a metallic alloy. Right, complex system, and there's different components, and how do they come together? And he would say that if he was getting into a kind of a rut, he wasn't really thinking well about how these alloying ingredients might be working in some sort of process, that he would go and do some improvisation, thinking. And the argument there is that he's actually accessing a certain kind of part of his cognitive tool set that then he can bring back into the scientific material science imagination, right? And I find that absolutely fascinating. But the thing with materials is that, you make a better material or a material that has a property or that you haven't had before. It makes us more powerful agents in the world. So you instantly have a kind of want. The obstacle is the material world doesn't want to yield. It's complex. It's hard for us to get exactly what we want. And if you're in the middle of an R&D project, you're not quite there yet, which is actually kind of nice tension. Maybe you'll win and maybe you won't. So I think almost every materials development story has a wow framework that you can find. Yeah, and then again, the various channels. You can always use the traditional print channel, but when there is imagery involved, even picture-driven storytelling is fantastic. In your case, we're talking music, so I might think of audio as well. I could imagine trying to weave a story in where the scientific sort of play in the laboratory relates to the musical play elsewhere. That kind of thing. Okay, and we can do, I don't know if we want to do Q&A. We might be, you guys are ready for lunch. I'm happy to answer questions, maybe even afterwards. Let's do one more, and then we can, I'll defer to organizers if we want to do a short Q&A. Otherwise, we can end, and I'll just thank you. So, yes.
Thanks, that was really cool. So I study the science of light, and I'm very interested in how light interacts with different materials. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that we sort of have these two little detectors on our face. And I'm always curious about, people viewing our eyes as sort of scientific instruments, and how would that change your perspective on what we're seeing, and people recognizing that, probably our most important sensation is actually governed by these laws that you can understand. So if you take your glasses off and look at a star, and it doesn't look like a dot, it looks like some other pattern, you can understand why it looks like that pattern, and how does that inform your perspective of what you see?
Okay, so I love this. I mean, this is getting a little bit more toward that awe platitude that I was talking about, before. People forget these things. Most people do, right? There's something absolutely amazing and astonishing going on every time we see anything, anytime we smell something, every time we taste something. And this is a point of departure into the whole science story. I mean, you can talk about evolution. You can talk about how energy interacts with, with material. In our case, biological material, an amazing kind of, cell-based sensors, our retina. So the fact that you have that sensibility, makes me think that you could really make things exciting to kids, for example, but to be able to connect it, to our in-body set of lab equipment, right? And of course, what also is amazing is, this blows me away every time I think about it, that we are only sensitive to the tiniest little splinter of the electromagnetic spectrum. But we sort of walk around thinking that we're seeing and experiencing and sensing all that there really is to sense. But in the end, if you really draw that out, we're essentially blind to really what's out there. A little bit. The book, the supervision book, which is the science imagery book, was an attempt, in a way, to make that clear. That we only see the tiniest proportion of the phenomena that are out there. So we'd have to talk a little bit more about, how would you drill in there and find some kind of wow story. It could be, some kind of experiment outside of our, the visual part of the spectrum that maybe you then convert into a, kind of the visual, just the way astronomy does this all the time. If we're looking at X-rays, well, of course you've got to turn that into a color that we see. So you could begin to, use this observation of our limited sensory capabilities, to really talk about all that there is to see out there, something like that. Yeah, I don't want to. If people want to keep going, I'm happy to do it. But we're at the hour.
If you want to go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just. I've always been interested in. I think culturally, we're in a time where we're revisiting a lot of kind of landmark stories that we thought we knew, and that we're trying to put a new lens on. So you talked about Chernobyl, right? You talked about the Manhattan Project, and I just feel like our field is so rich for a re-examination of that history. So one good example for me is like the story of Hidden Figures, right? So this is a movie that was published about a scientific endeavor that we thought we knew a lot about, right? We thought we knew who the key players were and who made significant contributions. And we see that there was a whole cohort of women, over 1,000 women, who played a critical role in making sure that those initiatives were successful. And I think that the nuclear community, similarly to the computer science community, has the same opportunity to retell the story of the Manhattan Project, but from the perspective of who other than Fermi, who other than General Groves was in the room making those decisions. So kind of looking back and kind of clarifying the record in a narrative form, I think it's interesting.
That's a great observation, and it maps onto something that some historians look into, which is called the hidden technician. Right, so it's not always the PI of the lab that really, we all know that that's just part of the story. So there are so many of these hidden figures and these hidden technicians that are absolutely imperative to the great science story. You can go to chemistry. There was actually at IU. I found out that there was a beloved glassblower there who was not a chemist, but was skilled in glass like no one else. And so the scientists could come down to this glassblower and have a discussion and say, look, this is what I'm trying to do. And the glass maker with that special imagination and set of skills says, okay, I think I know the glassware you need, would then make this unique piece of this instrument, and then some unique science could be done. I don't know if anybody has actually written a story about that person who's probably not with us anymore, but that's an example. There's so much of that. I could see a whole series. It would be a great book even, or a podcast of going in and finding these hidden technicians and really voguing them because they deserve it. And those stories would be quite interesting. So.
Thanks for your talk. I think that a lot of your presentation seemed to motivate itself and focus around ideas of beauty and awe, and I really appreciate that. I'm actually asking about something different, which is I think that science is extremely full of examples of really interesting stories centered around much more negative things like both just straight up failure and also personal rivalry and conflict. And I'm wondering, how much have you thought of those ideas in your narratives, and what place do they have in science communication?
Yeah, right. I actually do characterize myself, and I don't do this with self-denigration, as an oh wow science writer for the most part. Well, I've been doing a lot of editing for the last bunch of years. So I do focus on that side of it, and it came through. It's actually good feedback because I think I need to balance things out. But the stories that you're talking about are in some ways much more classic narratives. Where you do have rivalries and you've got jealousies, and even to the point where there's fraud and deception. You've got probably projects with very nefarious ends, things that are morally and ethically charged in various ways. I mean, this actually came up a lot when I was at DARPA. Very powerful technologies. That have double edges or multiple edges to them. An example of this was at the 60th anniversary of DARPA. There was a big symposium down at the waterfront. I was involved in creating a pop-up museum exhibit there. But it had this poignant moment where in one part of this enormous exhibit hall, there was a display of an advanced prosthetic project, including a recipient of one of these advanced prosthetics. These are ones that were controllable by thinking. And one of these recipients was there with the technology developer, shaking a hand and circled by 20 weeping people, because it was such a powerful moment of a beautiful technology. Sweep your eyes 20 yards away, and there's a bullet in the museum exhibit, forgetting the name of the program, but it was a steerable sniper bullet, which means that any one of us who are not expert snipers could pull a trigger and probably hit a target a mile away, and perhaps take an arm off, which would then need a prosthetic. So there I am, kind of in this one little tiny part of a convention center where I'm looking at, you know, the fruit of one of our great and storied technology development agencies, but having a lot of conflict, you know, in some ways. I mean, I'm proud to be a part of it, but also, you know, seeing that there are these many edges to technology. Point of all that being is those are very rich stories, but I kind of tend to also want to make sure we champion the beautiful side and the optimistic side, because we also really do need that. And I think science and scientific discovery, pushing the bounds of knowledge, is just one of the most uplifting things we've got these days. You know, I think we need both. But you know, you put your finger right on, you know, just a treasure trove of wow stories. Okay, thank you.